I remember the exact moment I realized I would never sleep properly again, and it wasn't during my first infiltration or my first dead drop, or even the first time I watched someone die because of information I had provided jobs. It was 3 weeks into my posting on Coruscant, sitting in a commissary on sublevel 47 of the Imperial Administrative Complex, watching a junior analyst across from me bite into ration bar, while the overhead lighting hummed with that frequency that meant the surveillance grid was cycling through its pattern check, and understanding with perfect clarity that every breath I took from that moment forward would be calculated, every word weighed, every expression rehearsed, and that the person I had been before accepting this assignment was already dead, buried under layers of false identity and fabricated history so deep that sometimes I couldn't remember which memories ran bent. The ration bar tasted like recycled protein and preservation chemicals, the way everything tasted in Imperial facilities, that flat, sterile flavor that seemed designed to remind you that comfort and pleasure were inefficiencies, luxuries the Empire had engineered out of daily existence. And I chewed slowly, mechanically, while my eyes tracked the security camera sweep pattern I had memorized during my first week, counting the seconds until the rotate back into position, knowing that in 4 hours I had a scheduled meeting with my controller in the sub-basement archives, and that if anything went wrong, if anyone noticed a slight deviation in my routine, or picked up on the micro-expression I might accidentally allow to slip through my carefully maintained mask, I would disappear into an interrogation cell so thoroughly that not even my skeleton would ever be recovered. The hum was there too, in the distance, if you listened past the city, a layered note that belonged to neither sky nor ground, but to the metal in between. Etons, strange what you absorb without anyone having to teach it to you. We never had a class labeled our submission 101O, but we learned the shape of stormtrooper armor before we learned the constellations. We learned not to look too long at officers, not to ask why the neighbor's eldest son did not come back from his RRA location for opportunities abroad, not to comment when the garrisonage patrol routes grew heavier after a rumor of Ashko insurgent activity. One, I heard the word Arabella for the first time in a Gardan's mouth, spoken with the same tone used for disease. It meant problem. Be simmer. It meant delay in traffic. Vice Cheryl, autonomous. It meant extra ID checks. It meant my father coming home later, because the shift change was held up at the scanners, while troopers ran their gloved hands along lunch pails and toolboxes, as if terrorism could be folded into a sandwich. The first time I saw an actual act of rebellion, it was not heroic. It was petty and stupid and terrifying. Or Nichiran and one later, I did not rest to bring that, like a stage show. Someone dropped a crude explosive under a fuel hauler at the edge of our district. The fire ate 3 blocks. It's a milk, and I think that girl. I could break it easy, boss. The Empire did not distinguish between whoever had placed it and the rest of us. They sealed off the area, dragged out people at random, and we watched as the garrison commander made an example. 2 workers I recognized, one I knew by name. My mother gripped my shoulder, so hard I felt bruises for days. I remember all. She whispered, "Our Empire is big. We are small. We are small. Small things get crushed when they stand in the way of big things." Oh. She meant it as advice. That's the cruel thing. Sometimes fear sounds like love. So I grew up, afraid of rebels. Afraid of being associated, of being near anything that might look like resistance when the scanners swept. Afraid that one day someone would decide my face was the wrong one, in the wrong crowd, and that would be enough. But fear is a bad architect. Nice assurance. It builds fragile structures. It leaves gaps. The gap opened the day a transport came in too low. It was just another ship. Clouds were thick and dirty, rain leaving grey rivulets down the windows. I remember the smell of it through the vents. Ozone, damp metal, and the sour tang of coolant from the processing plant upriver, like someone had tried to perfume rust. I was walking home along the edge of the cargo rail, listening to the distant hum of a patrol craft circling lazy arcs overhead. Then the hum changed. You can tell when engines are happy, and when the artery is screaming. Westival, and the artery claro, into bingoja, when I stroll the training. This one screamed. A violent rising whine, cut by stutters. I looked up. No, by Jerry, the initiates. The transport tore through the clouds sideways, its stabilizers firing in short, sick bursts. I could see the bluish corona of its shields flickering as it scraped the atmosphere wrong. People stopped in the street. Someone screamed. Someone ran. I just stared. No, why, Lancho. Oh, it almost recovered. On recovering, I stood there. I have been choking by my latitude dash. Almost. When the hull sheared, the sound arrived a heartbeat later. A gut punch concussion that rolled down the street and rattled the teeth in my skull. The shockwave knocked me to my knees. Wanted to get out, okay. How wide you gonna do? A section of fuselage broke off and skipped like a stone over the industrial sprawl, bursting apart where it struck a fuel depot. The sky turned white for a moment, and then angry orange as the flames found their shape. We watched it fall. The transporter's main body clipped the top of a residential block, disintegrated into glowing fragments, and vanished behind the horizon with a final flash. Silence pressed down in the wake of the impact, thick and stunned, broken only by groans and the crackle of small fires. The Empire sealed off the crash site. Within minutes, shuttles came and went. Ties screamed overhead. The holoprojectors lit up with statements about our regrettable mechanical failure and Iono, cause for concern, and my father came home late again, with the pale, pinched look of someone who had seen more bodies than he was prepared to count. When I asked him what happened, he just shook his head once and stared at his hands. I found out the truth, weeks later, in the shadow of a generator tower, from a boy who had an older cousin in the port administration. Oh, it was not mechanical. They whispered, eyes shining with the thrill of saying something dangerous. Or they say, it was hit, out in orbit, by a rebel cell. Mean, when a mission by car, they did not mean for it to come down here, but it did. Only orange. I should have felt only anger. Ned and Carol, Metropolitan touched about. Neither. Part of me did. However, I saw Widow, Medstecken, Ranisto, I'll be married. I did not think any of Dahl. But another part of me, a small traitorous part, buried somewhere under the conditioned fear, latched onto a different detail. A rebel cell had hit an Imperial transport in orbit. I reported to the administrative complex at 600 standard time, processed through security screening that included biometric verification, background verification, psychological baseline establishment, and a brief interview with a personnel officer who seemed to be reading from a script so standardized that they could have been replaced by a droid without anyone noticing. And within 2 hours, I was sitting at a workstation on sub-level 47, surrounded by hundreds of other functionaries doing identical work, all of us interfacing with data terminals that glowed with that particular blue-white light that Imperial designers seemed to favor, processing shipping manifests and supply requisitions and inventory. Reports with the kind of numbing repetitiveness that was clearly designed to crush any trace of individual initiative or creative thinking. The workstation to my left was occupied by a human woman named Cell, who had been in logistics for 11 years, and who spoke about requisition codes with the passionate intensity that other people reserved for religious faith. And the workstation to my right belonged to a man named Javin, who never spoke to anyone but occasionally hummed fragments of Imperial marches under his breath. While processing reports about Tibanna gas shipments to the Outer Rim, and within days I understood that this was where the Empire actually existed, not in the grand pronouncements and military operations and political machinations, but in these endless halls of functionaries processing data with mechanical precision. each of us a tiny component in a machine so vast that no one could comprehend its full. A word, order, unnecessary, necessary, alderon, a phrase, our entire planet, planetary planets. Ah, the holos repeated the same line. A tragic accidental due to an exploding fuel depot. Well, no one I knew had ever seen a fuel depot explode with that kind of yield, but arguing with the holos was like arguing with the weather. They spoke, you ducked. But then one night, late shift, I found a maintenance log on a console that someone had forgotten to close. It referenced increased traffic through the sector, redirected star destroyers, and a new term, a Death Star. Necessary, or now. I did not understand. National carry, never apprentice down. Not fully. I just knew that more ships than ever were moving, that people were talked about as tonnage and percentages, and that the universe was rearranging itself somewhere far away, indifferent to our little lives under its shadow. The next day, I met the woman who would recruit me. She came in as a replacement supervisor on the cargo loaders. Dark hair cropped short, standard issue uniform, datapad in hand. On the surface, she was like every other middle-tier Imperial functionary. Efficient, distant, uninterested in anything outside her task, but she asked questions that made no sense for an Imperial supervisor. She asked how often shipments went missing. She asked what we heard from our off-world relatives. Even though most of us were not supposed to have any, she watched the stormtroopers when they were not looking. Walking back to my workstation after that first drop, I remember noticing how my hands were trembling slightly. Adrenaline response to the knowledge that I had just committed an act of treason that would result in execution if discovered. But by the time I sat down and resumed processing requisition forms, the trembling had stopped, suppressed by the conditioning and the cover identity that needed Kestarvan to be exactly as boring and unremarkable as their personnel file suggested. And I spent the rest of that shift analyzing delivery schedules for industrial equipment being sent to construction sites in the Arcanis sector, while my heart rate gradually returned to baseline and the knowledge of what I had done settled into a compartment of my mind, where I could pretend it belonged to someone else. More destroyers. No, the ocean are clean. At the point, you don't see color. And Dustin, Marvel, Octavo, Night Dimble, a Briga, or Jimmy. Heavier escorts. Rando, Bernata Banura, our round attack and direction, only strouch. More encrypted shipments. Ochimar, Renakari, and Sin Rainisia clean. Order, not blind. All done. Ariane, not suicidal either, I muttered. She smiled, then not kindly. Or not just in the world, not cried out. Not so, or drives. Oriora, actually. You just have not decided what you are willing to die for yet. What up? That sentence stayed with me a long time. One generation, how? I got 1,000. Then, won't build Peter. Alone. We met again. Rachel, we met again. And again. Render now until. Then again. Right, so. Always in corners, where cameras were broken, or conveniently, are undergoing maintenance. Well, she never used the word Aria Bellina. At first, she talked about no information networks and about her people who care what the Empire is building out there. She asked about ship schedules, fuel manifests, unaccounted for containers. She never pushed. She never threatened. One day, I'll grenade injection, where a rabin steri, empty stops. She only laid out, piece by piece, a picture of a galaxy where the Empire was not an inevitability, but a choice made every day by people who did nothing. How do you think happened to Alderaan? No, this so, and okay, my don't look out still. she asked me once, as we watched a patrol shuttle lift off, its engine vibrating through the deck. Our Earthful depot exploded. I said reflexively, Arido, you believe that's right? How many more ago? I opened my mouth. Where's Sheriff? Wait, said Noir. Closed it. The propaganda itself was remarkably sophisticated, not crude or obvious, but carefully constructed to create emotional associations between the Empire and concepts like safety, order, prosperity, civilization, while associating the rebellion with chaos, terrorism, criminality, barbarism, and watching it week after week, it began to understand how easy it would be to actually believe it. Let the constant repetition erode your resistance until the lies became your truth. And there were moments when I would catch myself nodding along to some particularly effective piece of rhetoric, before remembering who I actually was, and feeling a spike of panic at how close I had come to losing myself in the cover identity. Our family. Wow, Misha, one kind, nice shirt with Starkville, until perishing. Never waking wisely. However, you have a garrison that will eventually notice the patterns, she replied. Around parents who will be safer if you are not standing next to them when that happens. The day I left, the sky over our district was clear. Ishendo, I went out to Manvat na Coruscant down Ralan, rolled down Sangra Stankin Nation, is to his fear. No transports in the lane, no patrol craft overhead. The air felt wrong without the hum. Much very Miss Timada and Shagnickars, and then ride to out. My mother cried quietly at the door. My father hugged me once. Oh, keep your head down now, he said. Nishan, Mretistero, or whatever you do. Mreshtar, Nankan Brave Martyrs, keep your head down. Narinrail, Namastabra, Naru. And the show, many could perceive what they technically say. On one day on, or a young little bit back out, I lied. What Darcy wrote. Once soon, one kind of natural production. The gatherings were depressing in their conformity. Everyone dressed in identical grey uniforms. Everyone speaking in the same flattened bureaucratic vocabulary. Everyone carefully avoiding any topic that might be considered politically sensitive. And the conversations rarely deviated from complaints about filing systems or requisition approval. Though occasionally someone would mention something useful, like Javan commenting during on-meeting that his department had been processing an unusual volume of shipments to the Scarif system, or a woman from personnel mentioning that recruitment had been increased for technical specialists with experience in planetary-scale construction. And I would file these fragments away, encoding them in memory using the monarch techniques they had taught us during conditioning, waiting for the next scheduled contact with my controller to pass them along. In those early days, I sat in a cramped compartment filled with consoles, running calculations that tried to stretch inadequate fuel, across too many missions, juggling requests for parts with lists of things we did not have and could not get. I learned the faces of squadron leaders not from seeing them in action, but from hearing their voices crackle over the comm, requesting last-minute loadout changes, more torpedoes, less this more that. I learned their call signs. I learned which ones sent a thank you to logistics when a mission went well. I learned which ones did not send anything at all, because their channel went dead in the middle of a run and never came back. We celebrated the destruction of the first Death Star in a mess hall that smelled of spilled synthale and overheated circuitry. The story spread faster than any official briefing. A farm boy, a lucky shot, the impossible weapon shattered into debris around Yavin. Someone piped in a grainy recording of the battle comms, and we listened to voices we did not know. Cry out marker calls, attack vectors, last-second adjustments, and then the roar when the shot hit. We raised cups and shouted, and laughed, with the manic relief of people who had just been told the monster under the bed could in fact die. But layered under all of that, for me, was something else. The casualty lists. I saw them before most. They came to logistics first, tagged with unit designations that had to be updated in deployment schedules. Pilots were moved from Reactiva to Ariekia in the roster, Replacement requisition. Forms opened automatically for their craft. The system processed them with the same tone it used for crate counts and fuel tallies. The Death Star was gone. So were so many of the pilots who had made it possible. I stared at the names. Non-standard uniforms. Ratio. Accents from worlds I had never heard of. Volunteers, most of them. People who had not grown up watching Imperial formations in awe, but in anger. I felt their absence like missing teeth every time a squadron leader called for a wingman, who would never answer again. It was around then that I started spending more time in the hangar. At first, it was just an escape from the screens. The hangar was physical, immediate. The smell of coolant and fuel was familiar in a way that the abstract notion of our aerotactical victorial was not. Mechanics cursed at stubborn couplings. Droids trundled between fighters, chirping resentment as they did the work no one else wanted to do. And always the hum. Fighters on standby, reactors at idle, like beasts asleep but ready. I watched pilots strap in and launch, watched them come back, sometimes on fire, sometimes missing parts, sometimes not at all. The ones who returned walked differently when they stripped off their helmets, lighter and heavier at once. Richard, aren't you zoomed out at once? Or you keep lurking? One of them said to me eventually, leaning against the fuselage of his X-Wing, while a mechanic reattached a scorched panel. Are you want to fly, or are you writing a thesis? No. That's sure, no. It's aunties. His name was Reed, call sign Maze. He had the relaxed posture of someone who had spent so much time flirting with death that they had decided not to take it personally anymore. Our logistics on, I said. Ahoy, make sure your torpedoes exist at the right time and place. Order, welcome, our nation, and Sue, our new, national, and the nightmare. Order, appreciated, pingman, he said. I don't know. No, I still does not answer the question. Needs very well. Bend the carrot and the carrot. I shrugged, feeling the pull in my chest. Our young always watched ships. Since I was a kid, not many chances to touch the controls where I own them from. No, never now in one chase. Ratio, Cadabra, or Pinocchio, and Rodabelle, Cadistar. Oh, there are chances here, he said. I'm a Dantooine, but not matter, he said. Oh, I know, enough pilots. Well, never enough pilots. You already know half the systems from the manifests. The rest you can learn. Oh, why not? Unless you like your hum from behind a desk. Now, I do. Noise is so. I'm in either. Well, yeah, in the study. That Jericho. The way he said, Huma, made me look at him sharply. Are you hear it too, Al? I said. Don't. He grinned. Ibis anthem in the galaxy. Racing my Darcy. You learn to ride it. You can make a starfighter dance. You interested? One sins. I was. Training was brutal and short. We did not have the luxury of long academies and simulated war games. We had a handful of old instructors, a few cobbled together sims reconstructed from stolen Imperial software, and the pressing fact that the Empire was hunting us on every vector. I lived in a residential unit that was identical to thousands of others in the complex. A space exactly 4 meters by 6 meters, containing a sleep pod, a hygiene station, a small desk with a data terminal for work-related tasks, and a storage compartment for the few personal possessions that Castavan was supposed to own, and I would spend my evenings in this cell, reading, and I would spend my evenings in this cell, reading. Approved Imperial literal, or watching approved entertainment programs, or processing additional work assignments, maintaining the pattern of a dedicated functionary with no life outside their duties. And the loneliness of this existence was something the conditioning hadn't fully prepared me for, the way it accumulated over weeks and months, a weight that pressed down on your consciousness until you started to forget human connection actually felt. You learn how small you really are. You also learn how big you can choose to be. We lost people. We always lost people. Sometimes to ties, sometimes to flak, sometimes to navigational errors that sent them into debris fields at the wrong angle. Their deaths were not glorious. They were often quick, messy, and full of frightened, truncated breaths. But every time, I felt that old conditioned fear of anything anti-imperial erode another layer. The people dying beside me were not monsters. They were exhausted, stubborn, ordinary beings who had decided the Empire built on their neck was no longer acceptable. The galaxy burned around us. Rumors of new superweapons, new crackdowns, entire sectors put under martial law. We hit what we could, where we could, supply lines, lone destroyers, fuel depots, communications relays. We stayed alive by never letting the Empire see the full shape of us at once. And then came Hoth. By then, I had flown enough sorties to feel the weight of my flight suit like a second skin. I had seen enough friends die that my grief had learned to walk on quiet feet. When High Command moved us to the ice planet, I did not complain about the cold. Cold meant isolation. Isolation meant it would take the Empire time to find us. When they did not come quietly. I remember the alarm first, not the calm hum of reactors, but the shrieking wail of perimeter, sensors picking up something big, dropping out of hyperspace. The meeting happened on schedule, disguised as another brief encounter, while I was supposedly researching historical precedents for current procurement challenges, and I passed the information in a conversation that lasted less than 60 seconds, mentioning casually that I had noticed some interesting resource allocation patterns that reminded me of the massive construction operations during the Clone Wars, and Vira nodded and made a non-committal observation of how the Empire parted ways, and I returned to my workstation to process more requisition forms, while wondering whether I had just handed the rebellion information about something important, or whether it was just another fragment in an endless stream of data that would ultimately prove meaningless. The fear of discovery was constant but varied in intensity, sometimes receding into background noise that you learned to live with, sometimes surging into acute panic that required conscious effort to suppress and control. There were days when I would notice an Imperial Security Bureau officer moving through the complex and feel my heart rate spike, wondering if they were there for routine surveillance, or if they were investigating something specific, if maybe they had detected the dead drop, or identified an anomaly in my behavior patterns, or received a tip from an informant who had noticed something suspicious, and I would have to force myself to continue working normally, to maintain the Kestarvan persona without any visible sign of the terror churning beneath the surface, while monitoring the ESB officers' movements through my peripheral vision and calculating exit routes, and wondering whether I could trigger the extraction protocol before they reached me. The extraction protocol was supposed to be a last resort, an emergency measure that would activate if I was compromised, and it involved a series of coded signals that I could send through the data terminal that would alert my handler and hopefully trigger a rescue operation. But we had been told during conditioning that extraction attempts often failed, that the Empire's security on Coruscant was too comprehensive and too sophisticated to reliably evade and on, that we should consider ourselves expendable assets whose primary value was the intelligence we could gather, rather than our individual survival. And this knowledge created a particular kind of fatalism, an acceptance that discovery would almost certainly mean death, that there would be no dramatic rescue or clever escape, just an interrogation cell and eventually a disposal chute feeding into Coruscant's lower levels, where The interrogation protocols were something they had tried to prepare us for during conditioning, sessions where they simulated Imperial interrogation techniques to help us build resistance and learn to protect the information that mattered while feeding interrogators plausible lies mixed with sacrificial truth. But everyone who had gone through the training understood that no amount of preparation could truly ready you for what Imperial interrogators were capable of: the combination of chemical coercion, neurological manipulation, and psychological torture that could break almost anyone given enough time. And the best we could hope for was to hold out long enough for the rebellion to implement damage control protocols, to evacuate other operatives who might be compromised by our capture, and to scrub the intelligence networks we had access to, buying maybe 48 hours before everything we used against the cause was out. "Are you coming out?" I muttered, running a hand along the fuselage. "I still don't check it out." The metal was cold. The hum inside was not. It vibrated faintly under my fingertips like a heartbeat. Strapping into the cockpit is a ritual. The same motions every time, until they become talismans against fear. Harness over shoulders. Straps cinched tight. Helmet locked. Hands on the controls, left on throttle, right on stick. Flick switches. In sequence. Check indicators. Origin well. Having a walk down the dog. Manchester is so dead. Feel the reactor R's. Unclimb, aligning with your pulse. Our squadron. Checking out. Came the controller R's voice. Our leader, standing by. Voice stone. On Easter. Help chunk until the card go down. Mention. Another me and the now. Noon. Varao. Well, yo. Our too. Standing by. We're not now. Most of Derek. What now? Lord Circuit Dungeon. Larry. Voices followed. Each call signed a small stubborn declaration that whoever held it existed, here and now, in this fragile craft between stars. I heard 9. Standing by all. I said when my turn came. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. What you needed? Michelle. Oh, Sanikome. The launch sequence has a unique silence. The external noise is cut off by the cockpit seal. Michelle, what I mentioned in the cockpit canal. For a few seconds, all you hear is your own breathing and the layered hum of the reactor and the life support system, a mechanical chorus holding you in its indifferent arms. Then the mag field drops and the stars rush in, and the silence breaks into comm chatter and alarm, pings and the low sound of your own blood, roaring in your ears. We dropped out of hyperspace into a sky already full of death. The Imperial formation spread before us like a city of knives. Star destroyers in careful tiers, their dagger profiles angled towards empty space that would not be empty for long, glittering lines of ties and holding patterns, like swarms of insects waiting for something to disturb their nest. Tankers nestled in the middle, fat and vulnerable and heavily shielded. Our orbit. The Force Senon breathed over the comm, forgetting to close their channel. I stay tight. Red Leader said, voice calm, in a way that might have been real or just long practice. Ira hit the tankers. There were moments during these screenings when I would look around at the other functionaries watching with me and wonder how many of them genuinely believed what they were seeing, versus how many were performing belief as a survival strategy, whether the person sitting next to me was actually convinced by the propaganda, or whether they were also hiding there, True thoughts behind a mask of loyalty. And this paranoia was both dangerous and necessary, because the instant you started trusting anyone, or revealing any doubt about Imperial ideology, you created a vulnerability that could be exploited either by informants who would report you to the ISB, or by the surveillance systems that monitored every conversation for signs of sedition. Individually, they were fragile things, lightly armored, no shields, dependent on speed and numbers. Together, they were a storm. I have never fully been able to describe what it feels like to fight 100 ships with one. The best I can say is this: imagine standing in the middle of a vast plain as 100 predators charge you from every direction, each fast enough to kill you in a blink. The only reason you're not immediately torn apart is that they get in each other way. The Imperial's greatest strength in that moment worked against them. Their formation discipline, their coordination, their reliance on overwhelming foresight, all of it created congestion. Too many ties trying to occupy too little space at too high a speed. Their instructors would have called it a target-rich environment. Her unit was identical to mine, except for a few minor personal touches. Some decorative items that suggested a small amount of individuality within the narrow parameters the Empire allowed, and she had prepared a modest meal using her ration allocation, supplemented with a few purchased items from the commissary, and we sat at her smalls while making conversation of protein, and processed vegetables while making conversation about work and life in the complex, and the entire interaction felt like a performance on both sides, both of us carefully maintaining appropriate boundaries and avoiding any topic that might be sensitive, and I left after exactly the socially acceptable duration for such a visit, having learned almost nothing about her actual thoughts or feelings, but having successfully navigated another test of the Kestarvan persona. Walking back to my own unit through the corridors of Sublevel 47, past hundreds of identical doors concealing hundreds of identical lives, I felt the weight of the isolation settling over me again, the knowledge that I couldn't have real relationships or authentic connections, or any of the things that made life worth living beyond mere survival. And there was a moment when I stopped walking and stood in the corridor wondering, what would happen if I just started screaming, if I let the mask drop completely and expressed all the fear and rage and despair that the conditioning had taught me to suppress. But the moment passed and I continued walking and entered my unit and sealed the door and stood under the shower until the water ration timer cut off the flow. And I didn't scream because screaming would have accomplished nothing except my own destruction. The torpedoes leaped from their racks, white trails curling in the vacuum as their guidance system snapped onto the Tankeron's signature. Around me, red Squadronors fire joined mine, a convergence of intent. The Tankerons, shields flared, struggled, failed. The first torpedoes exploded just above the hull, ripping open its outer skin. The ones behind drove into the womb. The explosion was not like the clean, contained detonations you see in training sims. It was messy. It was messy, fuel ignited, in tendrils that writhed before settling into a vast expanding ball. Shrapnel tore through its escorts, slicing a tie, squadron out of existence with no malice, just physics. The shockwave slapped my X-wing, making the cockpit jolt and my harness creak. I began to understand that my position, precisely because it was so boring and bureaucratic and unremarkable, provided a kind of visibility into Imperial operations that more glamorous intelligence targets couldn't access, because no one paid attention to logistics coordinators. No one thought that the person processing shipping manifests might be capable of understanding the implications of what they were seeing, and this invisibility was both my greatest asset and my greatest burden, because it meant I was uniquely positioned to gather valuable intelligence, but also that I was completely alone in this work, with no colleagues or support network, or any acknowledgement of the risks I was taking every day, just by existing in this space. We knew how to ignore the knowledge that each pass might be our last. We turned back into the swarm. Time dilated in those minutes. Seconds stretched into lifetimes, each filled with decisions that could not be taken back. Do you brake to shake the tide on your 6 and risk losing your lock on the tanker? Do you divert power from shields to engines and trust that the extra speed will keep you alive? Do you take the shot when your targeting computer flickers between green and amber? 7 hours, beeps became a frantic soundtrack. Lock warnings. Proximity alerts. Shield fluctuations. I'm single about Benny Great and what? Mountain can do. The cockpit was a riot of light, red and green, flashing and steady. My hands moved almost independently of my conscious thought, trained reflexes pulling the ship through corkscrews and dives that would have made my younger self sick. We scored hits. The second tanker took damage, its hull blistering under concentrated fire. Its external fuel lines ruptured, spraying glistening arcs that ignited into brief, lethal ribbons. But it did not die. And right here, cabin seaman, right on stern, right check canal, its shields, hastily rerouted and reinforced by some unseen Imperial engineer, held just enough. We were not so lucky. While they're in shell, and in the jarring, medicine letting around, and the charging our doctor was so. Horrid 5. I have got 2 on me. I are static. A scream. While medicine gun gather. I'll go on donation occurring. And it's valid out. Silence. Horse 12. In January 12. Nisenga. Our leader. My R2 has gone. The owner got up. No, don't say it. Let's do it. I didn't make him sick. Voices cut off, one by one, their last words incomplete. There are few sounds as haunting as someone realizing they will not finish their own sentence. I sat at my workstation, continuing to process shipping manifests, with hands that wanted to tremble, while ISB officers questioned people 3 rows away, working their way methodically through the entire department, and I ran through the extraction protocols in my mind, knowing they were probably useless but needing to feel like I had some plan, some action I could take if they came for me. And when they finally reached my station, the questioning lasted approximately 5 minutes, standard verification of appropriate mix of confusion and mild alarm that Kes Darwin would naturally feel in this situation. And the SB officer made notes on their datapad and moved on to the next workstation, and after they left I sat very still, for several minutes trying to process what had just happened, whether I had passed some test or whether they were simply gathering baseline data for future analysis. And I didn't know, could only continue if they returned. The lockdown lasted 6 hours before being lifted without explanation, no announcement about what they had been looking for or whether they had found it, and work resumed as though nothing had happened. Hundreds of functionaries returning to their tasks with that particular Imperial efficiency that treated every disruption as minor and temporary, and I processed requisition forms and shipping manifests for the rest of my shift while my nervous system gradually came down from its panic state. And that evening I violated protocol by visiting the archives outside my scheduled pattern to check whether the dead drop location had been compromised, and it hadn't. The data chip I had placed there 3 days earlier was gone as it should have been, collected by Vira or another handler, and I returned to my residential knowing I had taken an unnecessary risk by breaking pattern, but unable to tolerate the uncertainty any longer. Your world shrinks to the lines on your scope, and the knowledge that somewhere, someone is drawing a bead on you. I'll concentrate fire on that group. An Imperial voice crackled faintly over the open comm, the signal bleeding into ours. Ardenar, let them reach hyperspace. Wherever we are. Warrens, we jinked and rolled, formation breaking and reforming in messy little clusters. Ties streaked past, some overshooting, some fatally precise. I saw an interceptor rake fire across red, 2 Altman's engines. His X-wings spun, trailing smoke and flame, and then came apart as his fuel cells went. Our order point, coming up our K7 churn, Dache, our squadron mark, Machino, Action down, narrow conductor, mind sail, a sin what we are. Red leader shouted, Raiden, Harinksho. I pulled the lever. I learned to split my consciousness between the Kes Darwin persona that processed shipping, manifests with bureaucratic diligence, and the observer consciousness that monitored everything for threats and opportunities and anomalies, the part of me that remained separate from the cover identity, and that maintained the memories and commitments that connected me to the rebellion and to the person I had been before this assignment consumed my life. But that split was rude, exhausting to maintain, and there were days when I wasn't sure which consciousness was dominant, whether I was the spy pretending to be Kes Darwin, or whether I was cast-off and haunted by fragmentary memories of being someone else. And the identity bleed that the instructor had warned about was manifesting exactly as described, a gradual erosion of certainty about who I actually was beneath all the layers of performance and conditioning. Red Leader. Nisimero. Warren Kamichen. Darad Lincoln. Ultrikshi. Red 2. Roll. Our Ancient. Absent and occurring. At the Hillsima. On the center quality. Red 8.0. Unsure when the ground. One came Namandiro. Part result to that. Red 9. Damage soon. Red water. And the show. Or the ball of We numbered 12 when we left. We numbered 4 now. Now, silence settled over the channel after the last reply. It was not formal, hysterical, haberdashered by committee. No one declared a moment of it. We just stopped speaking. The hum in my cockpit filled the void, a constant reminder that the ship was alive, even if so many of us were not. Finally, Red Leader exhaled audibly. "Oh, we hurt them all," he said, as if reciting an obligation. "Our intelligence will confirm, but we know it. Those tankers are gone or crippled. Their next campaigns delayed. World's world, never see, will keep breathing because of this. Our No one answered. No one, one mouth said, "Let you know. Out by her, and let her. Numismatic notion box." No one answered. The words hung there, weightless in the absence of the people who had paid for them. "How's it course for home now?" he said quietly. "For next year I'm in Gartner. Michael collect general collecting. Or your towns left of it." "Oh, Merchant. I didn't die now. Or next stir our hell. No brownie curl today. I'll be regret." We jumped again. Well, back on the cruiser, the hangar felt too big. Spaceway craft should have been stood empty, marked only by the scuffed outlines of landing gear and the scorch marks of old takeoffs. Mechanics moved slowly, as if underwater. C7 trundled off to a droid bay without his usual annoyed whistle. Lyra was waiting by the ramp. When I climbed down, she scanned my face, my hands, as if counting limbs and expressions. "Are you alive?" she said, the statement edged with disbelief. I heard whispers about the destruction of Alderaan through a functionary in a different department who had a cousin in the Imperial Navy. Heard that an entire planet had been vaporized as a demonstration of Imperial power, and the scale of that atrocity was so enormous that my mind struggled to process it. Billions of lives extinguished in an instant to prove atrocess it. Billions of lives extinguished in an instant. Point or punish, dissent or demonstrate capability. And I realized with a kind of sick horror that this was what I was part of. This system that considered planetary genocide an acceptable tactical choice, and the knowledge that I was gathering intelligence that might help the rebellion resist this evil was the only thing that made my continued existence in this place tolerable. I passed the information about Alderaan's destruction to Vyra at our next meeting, though she almost certainly already knew through other channels, and she responded with a coded phrase that indicated the rebellion was aware and was adjusting strategy in response. And we parted as we always did, two strangers having a brief inconsequential conversation, but I carried the weight of Alderaan with me, back to my workstation. The knowledge that billions had died while I sat in a climate-controlled office, processing shipping manifests, and that night in my residential unit, I allowed myself to break protocol and cry, quietly, briefly, before forcing myself back into the emotional containment that survival in Imperial space required. The rebellion tells its pilots they bring hope to despair, Irene. In the end, both groups strap themselves into fragile machines, listen to the same reactor hum, and fly into lethal odds because someone above them decided the numbers made sense. Does the difference in ideology matter? Another, Matsumeri, Matdogo Dantooine, less of a difference in ideology matter. Yes, Oinum, Ganmurl, Open to know, Adiarashter. Absolutely. I have seen worlds the Empire would have burned left standing because we intervened. I have seen children run under skies, not blotted out by star destroyers because our raids delayed a fleet. I have seen the Empire's vision of an orderer up close, and I will never pretend that standing against it is anything but necessary. But necessity does not preclude cost. People like to think of rebel pilots as heroes. They imagine clean dogfights, daring maneuvers, witty last words transmitted over the comm. Before a glorious cinematic explosion, I was working longer hours at my assigned tasks to maintain the appearance of being a dedicated functionary while also gathering and encoding intelligence and executing the dead drops and meetings. And the exhaustion was accumulating in ways that made it harder to maintain the performance. Small cracks appearing in the Kess, Starve and persona that I had to consciously repair before anyone noticed. Drift during conversations, or when I would respond to questions with slight delays, while I processed what the appropriate response should be, rather than reacting naturally. And I knew that this degradation in performance was dangerous, but I had no way to address it without reducing my intelligence gathering activities, which would have meant failing the mission that was nightmare existence. In the years since that last flight, the war has shifted. The Imperial's grip has cracked, then broken. The symbols that towered over my childhood streets have been torn down or painted over. New governments debate laws in chambers that used to echo with Imperial commands. People talk about freedom as if it is a stable state rather than a constant act. The rebellion became an alliance. The alliance became something else. Flags changed, uniforms changed, the hum stayed. I still hear it in old ships repurposed for civilian trade, in transports carrying food instead of troops, in patrol craft that now bear different insignia but fly similar routes. The galaxy still moves along tracks, laid by reactors and engines, and the people willing to sit inside them. Sometimes, when I walk by a landing pad and feel a ship's vibration through my boots, I close my eyes and count. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's ours. How long it took for red forons, X-wing to vanish. 5, 6, 7, 8. That's ours. How long it took for my torpedoes to reach the tanker. 9, 10. That's ours. How long it took to pull the hyperdrive lever. We measure our lives in these small spans. Where? Seconds before annihilation. Or in Eastern and Corridor, Adventure, Adventure, Advance, seconds before escape. When it might not, mind is seconds before escape. Terror and hope woven together so tightly that they become indistinguishable. You are looking for something uplifting in that. You might say this. Every time a pilot chooses to fly anyway, knowing the numbers, they are making a statement the Empire never truly understood, that we are not just components in their machine. When they're seeing that we can look at a ratio like 100 to 1 and see not certain death, but a question. How much damage can we do to your certainty before you snuff us out? The truth is, none of us flew because we believed we could win cleanly. We flew because every time we clipped the Empire's armor, even by a fraction, we proved their doctrine wrong. They built their war machine on the assumption that fear scales, that one frightened citizen becomes 10, then 100, then a world. But they never understood that courage scales too, in ways they could not track or predict. A single pilot walking back from a mission that should have erased them carries something nobody in a throne room or command tower can quantify, the story that it tongues possible. And stories travel faster than hyperdrives. I remember the first time someone looked at me not as a pilot, not as a survivor, but as proof. We had docked with a small outpost after a supply runner. One of those half-frozen, half-forgotten rings where the walls sweat moisture and the lights flicker like the dead grieving. I was walking toward the mess, helmet under my arm, mind still half in hyperspace. A group of new recruits stood clustered near a bulkhead. One of them, barely more than a kid, nudged the others and whispered, "Artas, Red 9. He flew the tanker run. They say he came back alone. It was not true. I was not alone. None of us ever were, even when it felt that way, but the whisper scraped something raw inside me. It didn't feel like admiration. It felt like being turned into a measurement. A statistic wrapped in flesh. The same way the Empire reduced us to ratios on a holoscreen. Sometimes the Alliance did too, unintentionally. They didn't mean harm. They were just trying to make sense of why some of us kept returning, with soot on our armor and ghosts in our eyes. The kid saluted me. I raised a hand back awkwardly. He didn't need to know how many times I had trembled in my cockpit. Cold sweat soaking the lining of my gloves. He didn't need to know that bravery feels less like fire and more like ice, a numbness that lets you move even when your mind is begging you to stop. Later that night, lying in a bunk that creaked with every shift of my weight, I thought about him. I wondered how long it would be before he learned the truth beneath the legend. That flying is mostly fear, strapped to machinery. While I know that there is no clean separation between survival and luck. That skill keeps you alive for a while, but numbers always try to catch up. We all live under the shadow of the ratio, eventually. When I think back on that last flight, the one I have been circling around like a wounded animal, afraid to touch its own wound, I don't picture the tankers first, or the ties, or the detonations that painted whole arcs of space with shrapnel and vapor. I picture my own hands. They were steady. Steady in a way that felt unnatural, as if my body had known before my mind that something irreversible was unfolding. Every pilot has a moment where instinct and dread align perfectly, where you know the choice in front of you will define everything that comes after. That moment came for me, not during the opening volley, not during the run on the first tanker, but in the final stretch before the jump. The ties were not chasing anymore, they were hunting. There is a difference. Chasing is noisy, frantic, almost clumsy. Hunting is quiet, precise. The Empire's fighters operated like a single will when they slipped into that mode, a sick, synchronized elegance. They fanned out not to overwhelm us all at once, but to herd us. They cut off angles. I monitored my own behavior obsessively, reviewing every interaction and conversation for mistakes or anomalies, checking surveillance camera patterns and guard rotations and security protocols against my memory of their previous states to detect any changes that might indicate heightened awareness or investigation. And this hypervigilance was itself exhausting and self-destructive, creating a feedback loop where anxiety about being detected created more anxiety, and I could feel myself degrading under the pressure, the conditioning beginning to fray at its edges. Small moments of dissociation where I would lose track of which identity I was inhabiting, or forget why I was in a particular location. And I knew these were warning signs that I was approaching some kind of psychological breaking point, but I had no mechanism for addressing it, no way to request support or relief without compromising. Shell noticed something was wrong, asking me one day in the commissary whether I was feeling well, whether the increased responsibilities of my new position were causing stress, and her concern seemed genuine, but could equally have been an intelligence probe, an attempt to create an opening for me to reveal vulnerability or doubt that could then be reported to the SB. And I responded with appropriate deflection and I responded with appropriate deflection, acknowledging that the promotion had required some adjustment, but expressing satisfaction with the new challenges and opportunities, and she accepted this with a nod and a comment about how the Empire rewarded dedication and competence, and the moment passed. But I added it to my internal log of potential security concerns and other data points, suggesting that my performance might be slipping in ways that were becoming visible to others. That night in my residential unit, I stood in front of the small mirror in the hygiene station and looked at my reflection and barely recognized the person staring back. The face that had become Kestavan so completely that I couldn't see any trace of who I had been before, and I thought about the instructor who had warned us about identity, bleed, and wondered whether she had known how absolute the transformation would become, whether she had understood that what they were asking us to do wasn't temporary espionage but permanent dissolution, that we wouldn't return from deep cover because there would be nothing left to return, just a constructed identity occupying a body that used to belong to someone else. The intelligence I passed to Vyra during this period include information about a massive construction project designated as the Tarkin Initiative, shipping manifests indicating the movement of unprecedented quantities of resources to a facility that I still couldn't identify but that clearly represented something significant, something that the Empire considered important enough to dedicate enormous industrial capacity toward completing, and I encoded this information, along with everything else I had gathered about supply patterns and fleet movements, and transmitted it through the dead drop, and Vyra collected it as she always did, and the intelligence vanished into the Rebellion's analysis networks, where it would be correlated with other sources, and hopefully would contribute to understanding what the Empire was building, and how it might be countered. I had no way of knowing that this information might be connected to the destruction of Alderaan, that the weapon that had been used to vaporize an entire planet was the same project whose supply chains I had been tracking, but the manifests I had been processing were supporting the construction of the Death Star, and this ignorance was if I had understood the full, because if I had understood the fully magnitude of what I was documenting, the knowledge that I was watching the logistics of genocide unfold in requisition, forms and shipping schedules, I'm not certain my conditioning would have held, not certain I could have continued processing those manifests without breaking, without revealing through some involuntary response that I understood the horror of what I was facilitating by failing to sabotage the supply chains I had access to. The question of action versus intelligence gathering was one they had addressed during conditioning, the tension between the operatives' desire to intervene and disrupt Imperial operations versus the strategic value of remaining undetected and continuing to gather intelligence over extended periods, and we had been taught that our value to the Rebellion was almost always greater as observers than as saboteurs, that a single spy who could provide reliable intelligence over sabotage. But living with this calculus meant watching evil unfold, while doing nothing to stop it, meant processing requisitions for weapons that would be used to kill Rebellion fighters, meant facilitating operations that would result in suffering and death and oppression. And the moral weight of this complicity was something that accumulated over time, building into a burden that no conditioning could fully prepare you to, because you had to accept that required you to be part of its efficiency and effectiveness, even as you documented its operations for eventual resistance. And there were moments when I questioned whether this bargain was acceptable, whether any amount of intelligence was worth the compromise of participating in Imperial systems. But then I would remind myself that I had made this choice, that I had volunteered for this assignment knowing what it would require, and that the only way to honor that commitment was to. 18 months into the posting, the complex was hit by what the official announcements described as a terrorist attack, but what I suspected was actually a rebellion strike operation, an explosion in one of the lower-level power distribution centers that killed 17 functionaries and temporarily disrupted operations across multiple departments, and in the aftermath there was another security lockdown, more intensive than the first, with ISB officers conducting deep background checks on everyone who worked in or near the affected area. And I wasn't directly implicated because my workstation was in a different section, but the investigation created a ripple effect of paranoia and heightened surveillance that made every dead drop and every meeting with Vyra significantly more dangerous. The security protocols were upgraded, additional surveillance systems installed, random workstation inspections implemented, and I had to adapt my operational patterns in real time, changing drop locations and meeting protocols, and information encoding methods to compensate for the increased scrutiny. And this improvisation was exactly what the conditioning had trained us to avoid, because deviation from established patterns was itself a risk, but maintaining it. Vyra passed me a coded message during one of our meetings, indicating that the strike operation had been targeting a specific Imperial intelligence facility in the lower levels, and that the rebellion considered it a success despite the functionary casualties. And I felt a complicated swirl of emotions processing this information, understanding that those 17 dead people had been my colleagues in some sense. Fellow functionaries who might have been just as trapped in Imperial service as I was, but also recognizing that this was war and that rebellion operations necessarily involved casualties, and that my job was to gather intelligence and not to make strategic or moral judgments about how that intelligence was used. And I pushed the emotions down into the compartment where I stored everything that Kestarvan couldn't acknowledge and continued my work. The promotion had given me access to information about not just logistics, but also personnel movements, fleet deployments, and strategic resource allocation, and I began to see patterns that suggested major operations were being planned. Build-ups in specific sectors that indicated either coming offensives or responses to rebellion activities that I had no visibility into, and all of this information flowed through my meetings with Vyra and the Dead Drops, an ever-increasing volume of intelligence that I was gathering and encoding and transmitting with mechanical efficiency, even as I felt myself fragmenting under the psychological pressure of maintaining the cover identity and the operational security and the moral compartmentalization required to function in this environment. There were days when I would sit at my workstation processing manifests and realize that I had no memory of the previous hour, that I had been operating on pure conditioning and routine, while my conscious mind had retreated into some protected space where it didn't have to process the reality of what I was doing. And these dissociative episodes were becoming more frequent, and that assignment was consuming me in ways that might eventually make me ineffective or, worse, may even that eventually. 20 months into the posting, I attended a briefing where a senior Imperial officer presented an operational plan for what he called pacification operations in a sector where rebellion activity had been increasing, and the plan involved systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure and population displacement and retaliatory actions against communities suspected of supporting rebel forces. And listening to this, inside me, some barrier that had been holding back the full horror of what I was part of, and for several seconds I couldn't breathe, couldn't maintain the Kestarvan facade, and I had to fake a coughing fit to excuse myself from the briefing room, stumbling into a corridor where I leaned against the wall and tried to regain control while my conditioning screamed warnings about compromised operational security and behavioral anomalies and the need to suppress this reaction. I returned to the briefing after 2 minutes, apologizing for the interruption with some explanation about a respiratory irritation from the recycled air, and the officer continued his presentation, and I sat there taking notes on mass atrocity, with hands that were steady only because the conditioning had automated the Kestarvan identity, even when the psychological architecture was collapsing, and I encoded even when the psychological every detail of that operational plan in memory, and passed it to Vyra at the next contact window, knowing that this intelligence might allow the rebellion to evacuate or defend the targeted populations, but also knowing that it might be too late, that the operation might proceed regardless, that all I could do was document evil and hope that somewhere someone would use the information to resist it. The exhaustion was no longer just psychological, but physical, my body breaking down under the sustained stress and the disrupted sleep and the constant hypervigilance, and I started using stimulants from the medical dispensary to maintain functionality, small doses that kept me alert and focused, but that I knew were contributing to the overall degradation, adding chemical dependency to the list of problems that was slowly destroying my... The dispensary records were supposed to be confidential, but nothing in Imperial space was truly confidential, and I worried that someone analyzing my medical access patterns might notice the stimulant usage and flag it as a potential indicator of stress or unreliability. But I couldn't function without them, couldn't maintain the performance and the operational tempo and the intelligence gathering, and so I accepted the risk and continued using them and hoped that as seemed. Cell mentioned during one of our commissary meetings that she had heard rumors about increased ISB activity in the complex investigations into potential security breaches or loyalty concerns, and she said this casually, as though it were just another piece of gossip. But the timing and the specific phrasing made me suspect it might be a probe, an attempt to gauge my reaction to the concept of internal investigations, and I responded with appropriate concern, mixed with confidence that my record was clean and my loyalty was beyond question. And she nodded and changed the subject, and I added this interaction to my growing list of potential warning signs that someone might be paying more attention to me than I had realized. The dead drop locations had to be changed after 22 months because the archives section where we had been operating was scheduled for reorganization and increased security. And Vira passed me information about new protocols during what would be our last meeting in that location, coded instructions that I decoded later in my residential unit using the cipher. Techniques they had burned into my memory during conditioning, and the new arrangements were more complex and more risky, requiring me to make drops in sections of the complex that I had no legitimate reason to visit, creating the need for more elaborate pretexts and more exposure to areas where I might encounter personnel who would question my presence. The first drop using the new protocol went smoothly, but the second one nearly exposed me when I encountered an ESB officer in a corridor where I was supposed to be alone, and I had to improvise an explanation about being lost while looking for a specific storage facility, and the officer's skepticism was visible, their eyes scanning me in a way that suggested they were recording details for future reference, and they let me go with a warning to stay in authorized areas, but I knew that interaction would be logged somewhere, another data point that might someday be correlated with other anomalies, and used to build a case against me, and I violated protocol by aborting the mission and returning to my workstation without completing the drop, leaving the intelligence encoded in my memory for an extra 3 days, until the next scheduled opportunity, and those 3 days felt like 3 years. The weight of the information pressing make life physical. The identity bleed reached a critical point around month 24, when I realized during a routine conversation with Javan that I had been speaking as Kestarvan, not performing the Kestarvan identity, but actually inhabiting it, thinking their thoughts and feeling their concerns as though they were authentically mine. And it took me several seconds to even notice this had happened, to recognize that I had lost track of which consciousness had to suppress immediately, because I was in a public space surrounded by colleagues and surveillance systems. But the panic didn't fully recede even after I regained control, because I understood that this was exactly what the instructor had warned about, the gradual erosion of the boundary between covert and core identity. And I wasn't certain anymore whether that boundary still existed, or whether Kestarvan had consumed the person I had been before so completely. That night I tried to access memories from before the conditioning, deliberately pulling up specific images and sensations and relationships that should have been emotionally significant. And they came when I called them, but they felt distant and abstract, like memories that belonged to someone else, someone I had known, but wasn't anymore. And I understood with growing horror that the transformation was complete, that I had become my cover so thoroughly that the intelligence continued to flow, an ever-increasing stream of information about Imperial operations and strategic planning that I gathered and encoded and transmitted through the dead drops and meetings with Vira. And if anyone was analyzing the aggregate value of what I was providing, they never communicated it to me, never sent any message indicating that my work was making a difference or contributing to all was part of the operational security protocol. There were moments when I fantasized about exfiltration, about receiving a coded message from Vira, telling me that my mission was complete and that an extraction team was coming to pull me out, that I could stop performing and stop gathering intelligence and stop living in this state of constant fear and identity dissolution. But those fantasies were dangerous because they undermined the commitment that was necessary to continue operating effectively, and I learned to suppress them as completely as I suppressed every other authentic emotion or desire that might compromise the mission, becoming more machine than person, more protocol than individual. a biological intelligence gathering system that happened to occupy a body that had once belonged to someone, with a name and a history in a cell. 28 months into the posting, I identified intelligence suggesting that the Empire was planning a major operation against a rebellion base. Specifics about fleet composition and logistics, support, and operational timeline that could potentially allow the rebellion to prepare defenses or evacuate the facility. And I passed this information through an emergency protocol that we had established for time-sensitive intelligence. I dropped that it as carefully as possible, but I knew that any deviation from established patterns was dangerous, that I was gambling that the value of the intelligence was worth the exposure. And after completing the drop, I spent the next 72 hours in a state of acute anxiety, waiting to see whether ISB officers would come for me, whether the pattern deviation had been flagged by anomaly detection systems, whether I'd finally made a mistake that would end everything. The officers never came, the drop was apparently successful, and life in the complex continued with its usual oppressive normality. But I didn't know whether the intelligence had reached the rebellion in time to be useful, didn't know whether the base was saved or destroyed, didn't know whether the risk I had taken had accomplished anything. And this uncertainty was somehow worse than knowing I had failed, because at least failure would have been a definitive. But come and no forward. The stimulant usage increased as I approached month 30, my body requiring larger doses to achieve the same effect, the tolerance building in ways that I knew were unsustainable, but that I couldn't address without reducing my functionality below the threshold necessary to continue the mission, and I began to experience side effects, tremors and insomnia, and occasional cardiac arrhythmias that were concerning but not yet severe enough to prevent me from working. The medical dispensary records were becoming a liability, a documented pattern of increasing stimulant access that would certainly flag attention if anyone reviewed them. But I had no choice except to continue, or to accept that my ability to gather and process intelligence would degrade to the point where I was no longer contributing value, and the conditioning had taught me that my value as an intelligence asset was the only justification for my existence in this role, that if I couldn't perform the mission, then there was no reason for me to continue occupying Kestarvan's identity. And this logic led to dark places that I tried not to think about too carefully, because they involved the suicide protocol, and the question of when failure to perform became sufficient justification for self-termination. 32 months into the posting, everything changed in a moment that I couldn't have predicted or prepared for. A random encounter in a commissary where I was eating a ration bar, while monitoring surveillance patterns, when a functionary I had never seen before sat down across from me without invitation, and said in a voice that was carefully neutral and quiet enough not to carry beyond our table, "Your controller was arrested 3 days ago," and the words hit me like a physical impact. The functionary continued speaking, before I could formulate a response, telling me that Vira had been compromised during a separate operation, that she had been taken to an interrogation facility, and that standard damage control protocols had been implemented, that other operatives in her network were being pulled out, or going dark, and that I needed to make a choice about whether to attempt extraction or to continue operating under restraints. New handler, and this person across from me was looking at my face while delivering this information as though they could read every micro-expression and calculate exactly how compromised I was. And I realized that this was a test, that everything about this interaction was designed to determine whether I could be trusted or whether I had already been turned by Imperial interrogators who were using me to identify other rebellion assets. I responded with the appropriate coded phrase that should have verified my identity and status, and the functionary nodded and told me that an extraction window would be available in 48 hours if I chose to use it, or I could transition to working with a new controller and continue gathering intelligence. And then they stood up and walked away without waiting for my decision, disappearing into the crowd of functionaries moving round the commissary. Remains of my ration bar, feeling my carefully constructed world, fragmenting around me, knowing that Vira's arrest meant she would be interrogated, and that no matter how well trained she was, or how much resistance she could offer, eventually they would extract information from her, names and protocols, and descriptions that might include me, and that I might have hours or days or weeks before ISB officers came to take me to the same interrogation facility where The 48 hours until the extraction window were simultaneously the longest and shortest of my entire posting, time distorting in ways that made minutes feel like hours and hours feel like seconds, and I continued performing my duties as Darvin, while privately calculating the risks and benefits of extraction versus continued operation, weighing the intelligence value I might still provide against the probability that it might eat. The conditioning had trained me to prioritize mission success over personal survival, but the conditioning had been designed for people who still had a self to sacrifice, and I wasn't certain anymore what was left of me beyond the Darvin identity. Whether extraction would even be meaningful when there was no original identity to return to, no person waiting to be recovered from underneath the cover. Just layers of performance and protocol, with no things. I processed shipping manifests and attended briefings and maintained all the usual routines, while this calculation ran in the background of my consciousness, and I realized that I had already made the decision during the first few seconds after the functionary delivered the message, that some part of me had immediately chosen to continue operating, not because it was the strategically optimal choice, but because it was. The extraction window came and went without me attempting to use it, and I continued working and gathering intelligence and processing information about Imperial operations. But now without the regular contact with Vyra, without the dead drops and meetings that had structured my entire operational pattern for over 2 years. And the isolation of this was profound in ways I hadn't anticipated, because those brief contacts had been the only acknowledgement that I existed as something. I waited for contact from the new handler that the functionary had mentioned, watching for signals or approaches that would indicate the rebellion was re-establishing communication, but days passed, and then weeks, and nothing happened, and I began to suspect that the damage control protocols had been more extensive than I had understood, that perhaps they had decided to let me continue gathering intelligence, but without active handling, treating me as a passive asset who would continue reporting through some mechanism I hadn't been informed about. Or perhaps they had simply written me off as too compromised, or too risky to maintain contact with, leaving me in place but abandoned, still operating, but no longer part of any larger network or mission architecture. 36 months into the posting, I heard through unofficial channels that there had been a major rebellion victory, that Imperial forces had suffered a significant defeat somewhere in the Outer Rim, and while the official propaganda dismissed it as a minor setback, and promised swift retribution, the reaction I observed in senior officers suggested it was more serious than the public narrative acknowledged. Deployment orders changing and resource allocation shifted. I didn't know whether any intelligence I had provided had contributed to this victory, couldn't know whether the manifests I had processed and the fleet movements I had documented and the operational plans I had memorized had played any role in enabling rebellion forces to achieve success. But I allowed myself to hope that maybe my work had mattered, that the years of fear and isolation and identity dissolution had contributed something meaningful to larger struggle, even if vision that mocked. This hope was dangerous because it created emotional investments in outcomes I had no control over, but I clung to it anyway, because it was the only thing preventing me from acknowledging the possibility that everything I had done was meaningless, that I had destroyed myself for nothing, that Darvin had consumed my original identity in service of a mission that had produced no tangible results beyond my own ongoing suffering. The functionality problems became more severe as I entered the 4th year of the posting. The combination of sustained stress and stimulant dependence and psychological fragmentation, creating a cascade of breakdowns that I could no longer fully compensate for through conditioning and willpower alone, moments of confusion and lapses, and emotional leakage that were increasingly difficult to explain away as fatigue or minor illness. Cell noticed the degradation and expressed concern that was either genuine or was part of an investigation, asking whether I needed to request medical leave or psychological evaluation, and I deflected with assurances that I was managing the demands of my position adequately and that any signs of stress were temporary and within normal parameters. But I could see skepticism in her expression, a doubt about whether I was actually as functional. The medical dispensary refused my next stimulant request, citing concerns about dosage patterns and recommending that I see a physician for evaluation. before continuing the medication. And this created an immediate crisis because I couldn't function at the necessary level without chemical support. But accepting medical evaluation would expose me to scanning and questioning and record generation that might reveal anomalies in my neurological architecture. I continued working, without the stimulants, pushing through the fatigue and cognitive fog, through pure discipline and the remnants of my conditioning. But the degradation accelerated, my performance metrics declining in ways that would certainly be noticed during the quarterly review cycle, and I understood that I was approaching the end of my operational viability. That soon I would either need to request extraction through whatever mechanisms might still accept extraction had been. The question of the suicide protocol became more immediate, no longer a theoretical contingency, but a practical consideration that I rehearsed mentally, planning the specific moment when I would activate it if ISB officers came for me, the exact bite pattern that would release the toxin, and grant me the few seconds of oblivion before they could begin interrogation. And this planning was itself a form of acceptance, acknowledgement that my mission had reached its terminal phase, and that the only remaining. 42 months into the posting. I was sitting at my workstation processing manifests when I noticed a pattern in the shipping schedules that suggested Imperial forces were preparing for a major operation in a sector where I knew, through intelligence I had gathered months earlier, that significant rebellion assets were concentrated, and I understood that this information needed to be transmitted immediately if it was going to be useful, that warning the rebellion about this impending operation might save lives and assets and enable effective resistance. But I had no handler to pass the information to, no dead drop location that was still operational, no communication channel that hadn't been compromised or abandoned. I spent 6 hours encoding the intelligence in a format that could be transmitted through multiple potential channels, preparing redundant copies using different coding schemes in case one method was compromised or corrupted. And then I did something that violated every protocol I had been taught, something that the conditioning should have prevented me from even considering. I used my access to the complex's communication systems to send an encrypted data that I had memorized during training as an absolute emergency backup, a method that was supposed to be used only in situations where imminent compromise made operational security irrelevant because capture was inevitable, and by using it, I was essentially announcing my presence and identity to any Imperial signals intelligence systems that might be monitoring those channels, exchanging whatever remained of my cover for one final intelligence transmission that might ameliorate its intent to shift. The transmission completed in 2.3 seconds, a compressed burst of encoded data that disappeared into the complex communication infrastructure. And I sat at my workstation knowing that I had probably just ended my operational life, that signal analysis would eventually identify the source terminal and trace it back to me, that my exposure was now just a matter of time. But I felt something that might wait. The hours after the transmission were strange, a combination of continued routine, performance of my duties, and underlying anticipation of the moment when ISB officers would arrive to take me away. But that moment didn't come immediately, didn't come that day or the next day or the day after, and I began to wonder whether the transmission had even been detected, or whether Imperial signals intelligence was simply being patient, allowing me to continue operating mildly my connectivity of dates. 44 months into the posting, I received a message through the internal communication system, asking me to report to a conference room on a level I had never been assigned to work on. No explanation or context provided, just a time and location and the implication that attendance was mandatory, and I understood with calm certainty that this was it, that they had finally come for me, that the investigation had concluded and I was being summoned for our standard. I rehearsed the suicide protocol mentally, confirming the bite pattern and preparing myself psychologically for the activation moment. And I reviewed the conditioning techniques for pain management and information compartmentalization, knowing they would be inadequate against Imperial interrogation technology, but hoping they might buy enough time for damage control protocols to protect other rebellion assets. I arrived at the conference room at the specified time, expecting to find ISB officers waiting with restraints and interrogation equipment, but instead I found only a single functionary sitting at the table, and they looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy or assessment, or nothing at all, and they said in that same carefully neutral voice that the functionary in the commissary had used 2 years earlier. The operation you transmitted intelligence about it's been disrupted. Thanks you for your service and offers you extraction if you want it. But there are no guarantees about success and no promises about what comes after if you survive. And I understood that this was real, that the transmission had worked, that the intelligence had reached the rebellion and had been used effectively, that my years of sacrifice and fear and identity, dissolution, had actually accomplished something measurable and meaningful. And the functionary was waiting to know whether I wanted to attempt. I looked at this functionary, whose name I didn't know, and whose face I would forget within hours, because that was how operational security works, and I realized that I didn't know how to answer their question, because leaving Imperial space meant abandoning the Kest-Darvan identity that had consumed me so completely, that I didn't know who or what would remain if that framework was stripped away, but staying meant continuing to exist in a state of constant fear and isolation. The functionary seemed to understand my hesitation, telling me that I had 48 hours to decide, that they would provide details about the extraction protocol if I chose to use it, and that I chose to stay, they would work to establish a new handling relationship that would allow me to continue reporting intelligence. And then they left, walking away like the previous functionary had walked away, leaving me alone in the conference room with the weight of a decision that I definitely do not occur. I returned to my workstation and continued processing shipping manifests as though nothing had happened. The Kest-Darvan performance continuing with mechanical reliability, even though something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my situation. The knowledge that extraction was possible, creating a form of cognitive dissonance with the assumption that this assignment would continue until death or exposure, and I spent the next 48 hours in a state that was almost dreamlike, going through all the usual routines while privately trying to imagine what the future might look like. Extraction and the attempt to reconstruct some kind of existence outside Imperial space, versus continued operation and the guarantee of eventual capture and termination, and both futures seemed equally impossible. Sel asked me again whether everything was all right. Her concern now out enough that I couldn't dismiss it as casual inquiry, and I gave her the same deflections I had been giving for months, the same assurances that I was managing and functioning and fulfilling my duties adequately. But I could see that she didn't believe me anymore, that whatever mask I had been maintaining was deteriorating visibly, and I added this to the list of factors suggesting that my operational viability was approaching its end, regardless of what decision I made about extraction, that the Kest-Darvan identity was fragmenting, and that soon there would be no way to maintain the performance at a level sufficient to avoid triggering investigation. The decision, when I finally made it, wasn't really a decision at all, but rather an acknowledgement of what I had already become. The recognition that I was Kest-Darvan now, more than I was anything else. That the original identity that might have been worth extracting had been overwritten years ago. That leaving Imperial space would mean existing in a void with no framework and no purpose and no structure to organize consciousness around. I contacted the functionary through the mechanism they had provided and informed them that I would remain in place and continue operating, and their response was brief and professional, acknowledging my decision and providing details about new protocols for intelligence transmission that would reduce the risk of exposure while maintaining reporting capability. And there was no judgment in their communication, no attempt to persuade me toward a different choice, just acceptance of. The new protocols were more sophisticated than the old dead drop methods, involving encrypted data bursts transmitted through compromised Imperial communication channels that had been infiltrated by Rebellion Signals intelligence, methods that carried their own risks but that eliminated the need for physical meetings and dead drops that could be observed and tracked by ISB surveillance systems. I adapted to these new methods with the same mechanical efficiency that I had adapted to everything else during this assignment, the conditioning providing the framework for learning and implementing new operational procedures, even as my psychological currents continued to degrade, and the intelligence continued to flow information about Imperial operations, and strategic planning and resource allocation transmitted in compressed bursts that the isolation of this new arrangement was even more complete than before. No handlers or meetings, or any acknowledgement that another human being was receiving the intelligence I was generating. just the act of transmission itself, and the faith that somewhere someone was collecting and analyzing and using the information. And this faith was all that sustained me as I entered what I understood would be the final phase of my operation. 48 months into the posting, the signs that I was being investigated became unmistakable. Small changes in how colleagues interacted with me. The way conversations would sometimes stop when I entered a room, the slightly longer delays in access approval when I logged into systems, the occasional presence of SB officers in my department, who seemed to be conducting routine security reviews, but whose attention lingered on me in ways that suggested specific interest. I transmitted this information through the new protocols, warning the rebellion that my exposure was likely imminent and that they should implement whatever damage control measures were appropriate for a compromised asset. And I continued gathering intelligence with increased urgency, documenting everything I could access about Imperial operations in the time that remained before they came for me. And there was a kind of clarity in this terminal phase. The knowledge of the stimulant dependency was now severe enough that withdrawal symptoms made normal functioning impossible, but the medical dispensary had permanently flagged my access, and I was forced to obtain chemical support through black market channels that existed even within the rigid hierarchies of Imperial space. Functionaries who sold controlled substances to other functionaries who needed them to maintain the productivity standards that the Empire demanded. And accessing these channels created additional exposure because it required interactions with people outside my normal operational circle. Transactions that could be observed and documented and used as evidence of behavioral anomalies when the investigation finally reached its conclusion. Cell stopped speaking to me entirely around month 50, just ceased acknowledging my presence as though I had become invisible or had never existed. And this withdrawal of even superficial social contact was a clear signal that she had either been instructed to avoid me by SB officers who were building their case or had independently decided that association with me was dangerous to her own security, and I didn't dangerous to her own security. Blame her for this choice, because it was the rational response in an environment where proximity to a suspected traitor could compromise your own standing. But the loss of even those minimal interactions deepened the isolation in ways that made it harder to maintain the distinction between the performance of Kestarvan and the consciousness observing the performance, the boundary eroding until there was only the role and nothing underneath it. I continued processing shipping manifests and attending briefings and transmitting intelligence through the encrypted channels, functioning with a kind of automated precision that required no conscious direction, and I began to understand that this was how it would end, not with arrest and interrogation, but with a gradual dissolution of self until I simply ceased to exist as anything other than a biological intelligence processing system, a ghost haunting the machinery, operation, and the patterns I identified during this period were increasingly significant. Intelligence about major Imperial offensives being planned against rebellion strongholds, about construction projects that suggested new weapon systems or strategic installations, about political machinations within the Imperial hierarchy that might create opportunities or vulnerabilities that rebellion strategists could exploit. And all of this information flowed through transmissions with increasing urgency, because I understood that my window for contributing intelligence was closing, that soon the investigation would reach its conclusion, and I would either be arrested or would simply disappear, eliminated quietly without trial or formal charges, because that was how the Empire dealt with internal security, through acknowledged publicly. There were moments during briefings when I would make eye contact with senior officers and see something in their expression that suggested they knew what I was, that they had been briefed about the investigation and were aware that they were sharing information with a confirmed or suspected rebellion spy. And these moments created a strange dissonance where I was simultaneously completely exposed and still required to maintain the performance, because the investigation apparently gathered. 54 months into the posting, I transmitted intelligence about a planned Imperial operation that would target a rebellion cell operating in the core worlds, detailed information about timing and force composition, and tactical approach that could potentially allow the cell to escape or prepare adequate defenses. And this transmission was detected by Imperial signals intelligence systems, flagged as suspicious and traced back. to my terminal within hours, and I knew the moment it happened because the response was immediate and unmistakable. ISB officers arriving at my workstation with restraints and weapons, surrounding me before I could activate the suicide protocol, securing me with an efficiency that suggested they had been prepared for exactly this moment and had taken precautions to prevent any self-termination attempt. They didn't speak to me or explain the charges or provide any of the procedural elements that would have been present in a legitimate arrest, just secured me and transported me through corridors I had never seen before, deeper into the complex, into sections that existed below the official maps, and I understood that I was being disappeared, taken to interrogation facilities that didn't officially exist, where suspects could be processed without any record or. The interrogation cell was smaller than I had imagined, perhaps 3 meters square, with smooth walls that had no visible seams or panels, illuminated by light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A space designed to disorient and isolate and break down psychological defenses before any active interrogation even began. And they left me there alone for a period of time that could have been hours or days. No footdoors coming would be worse than anything. Coruscant. The suicide protocol was no longer an option, because they had scanned my jaw during intake and neutralized the implants, removing the only control I had retained over my own fate, and this loss was somehow more terrifying than the prospect of interrogation itself. The knowledge that I would be forced to experience whatever they chose to do to me without any escape or termination option, that my consciousness would remain in Maya through all of it until either death or complete psychology. When the interrogator finally arrived, they were not what I had expected, not cruel or sadistic or obviously violent, just professional and clinical, explaining in neutral tones that they already possessed most of the information they needed about my network and operations, and that the interrogation was primarily designed to confirm details and identify any assets or protocols they might have missed, that cooperation would resist. The interrogation techniques combined chemical agents that suppressed the conditioning and made memory compartmentalization impossible with neurological stimulation, that created pain responses without causing physical damage, methods that had been refined over years of Imperial security operations, to extract information with maximum efficiency and minimum concern for the subject's well-being or survival. And I tried to resist using every technique to protect the networks and operatives I knew about, but the chemicals made lying almost impossible, and the pain made sustained resistance unbearable, and within what felt like hours, but might have been days, I had provided them with everything I knew, names and locations and protocols and operational patterns, all of it extracted and recorded, and processed for use against the rebellion assets I had spent 4.5 years trying to protect. The knowledge that I had broken, that the conditioning had failed, and that I had betrayed everything I had sacrificed for, was worse than any physical torture they had inflicted, a psychological wound that cut deeper than the neurological pain, and I begged them to kill me, to end the interrogation, and terminate me because there was nothing left to extract, and no reason to continue existing. But they refused, explaining that I still had value as a case study for training other interrogators and analyzing rebellion conditioning techniques, that my consciousness would be maintained and studied until they had extracted every possible insight about how rebellion intelligence operations function, and how operatives were trained, and what vulnerabilities existed in their psychological architecture. The time after the interrogation became indistinct and fragmented, periods of consciousness interrupted by medical procedures and chemical treatments and sessions, where they would extract me from the cell and force me to review intelligence reports and identify patterns that might reveal intelligence reports and identify patterns that might reveal additional rebellion operations, using my knowledge and training as a tool against the very cause I had destroyed myself trying to serve. And there were moments when I hoped they would make a mistake or an error in my medical management that would allow death to finally claim me. But they were too professional and too experienced to allow that kind of escape, maintaining me in a state that was functional enough to be useful, but degraded enough that I posed no security risk. I learned through fragmented information during these sessions that the intelligence I had provided had led to the arrest of dozens of other operatives, the dismantling of several intelligence networks, the compromise of communication protocols and dead drop locations and safe houses across multiple sectors, that my failure had cascaded through the rebellion's intelligence infrastructure, causing damage that would take years to recover from, and this knowledge was its own form of torture, more effective than any physical coercion, because it meant that everything I had sacrificed had ultimately served the Empire rather than the rebellion, that Darvin had not just consumed my original identity, but had proven to be my true self all along, an Imperial functionary who had briefly played at being a rebel before returning to serving the system that had created them. The functionary who had offered me extraction appeared in my cell one day, though I couldn't be certain whether this was real or whether the chemicals they were using had damaged my perception enough that I was experiencing hallucinations, and they looked at me with an expression that might have been pity or disappointment, or nothing at all, and they said that the rebellion had known I was compromised before the final arrest. Behavioral degradation had become visible enough that they had implemented damage control protocols weeks earlier, that most of the networks and operatives I had provided information about were either fictional or had already been evacuated, that the Empire had captured me under the mistaken belief that I was still a functional asset, when in fact I had become a deception operation, a source of false intelligence designed to waste Imperial resource and expose their interrogation map. I didn't know whether to believe this, whether it was truth or just another layer of psychological manipulation designed to provoke some new response or reveal some additional information, but I wanted to believe it. My suffering had served some purpose beyond simple failure, that even my breaking and betrayal had been anticipated and incorporated into larger strategic deception. But the wanting itself made me suspect it was because time became meaningless in the interrogation facility, periods of consciousness and unconsciousness leading together until I couldn't track days or weeks or months, couldn't maintain any coherent sense of duration or sequence. Just an endless presence of clinical procedures and chemical treatments, and the occasional session where they would extract information or test responses, or study the ruins of my conditioning to understand how it had been constructed, how it had failed. The Darvin identity had fragmented completely, no longer a coherent persona, but just scattered behavioral patterns and reflexive responses that activated randomly without any organizing consciousness. And the original identity that had existed before the conditioning was equally inaccessible. Memories that felt fictional or imported from someone else's life, and what remained was just raw awareness, consciousness without self. There were moments when I tried to remember why I had volunteered for this assignment. What combination of conviction and desperation had led me to accept the conditioning, and the cover identity, and the mission that had ultimately consumed me so completely. But those motivations were no longer accessible, lost somewhere in the wreckage of fragmented identity and broken conditioning. And all I could remember was the instructor's warning of identity and broken conditioning, and the understanding that the interrogator explained during one of the final sessions that I would not be executed or disposed of in the traditional sense, that instead I would be reconditional, then assigned a new identity and reinserted into Imperial logistics operations where my knowledge and experience would be valuable, that the Empire did not waste useful resources, even when those resources had been compromised or damaged, that I would continue serving just as I had always served, but now with complete loyalty. I tried to resist this reconditioning, tried to maintain some core of awareness or memory that would persist through the process, but the techniques they used were more sophisticated than anything the rebellion had employed during my original conditioning, methods that rewrote neural architecture at fundamental levels, and I felt myself dissolving under their procedures, consciousness fragmenting and reconstructing in patterns that no longer contained any trace of resistance or When I woke up in the new body that wore my face, I was Darvin again, but this time completely. No observer consciousness or hidden identity or compartmentalized self, just a logistics coordinator who had experienced some kind of medical incident that required rehabilitation and reconditioning, and who was now ready to return to their duties, processing shipping manifests and supporting Imperial operations with the same dedicated efficiency they had always displayed. My supervisor welcomed me back and expressed satisfaction that the medical procedures had been successful and that I would be able to continue contributing to our department's mission, and I thanked them for their patience and understanding and returned to my workstation on sublevel 47. surrounded by hundreds of other functionaries doing identical work, all of us interfacing with data terminals that glowed with that particular blue. Cell nodded at me as I sat down, a brief acknowledgement of my return, and Javan hummed fragments of Imperial marches under his breath, while processing reports about Tibana gas shipments to the Outer Rim, and everything was exactly as it had always been, the rhythm of Imperial life on Coruscant governed by protocols so specific and comprehensive that they regulated every aspect of daily existence. I was content in this role fulfilled by contribution to the vast mansion. But sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, when consciousness had not yet fully engaged with the protocols that structured my days, I would experience flashes of something that might have been memory or might have been dream, fragments of a different existence where I had been someone other than Kestarvan, where I had believed in something beyond the Empire, and had sacrificed everything in service to that belief, where I died and been reborn and died again, until that such thoughts were just neural noise, random firing patterns that had no meaning or significance, that I was Kestarvan, and had always been Kestarvan, and had always been Kestarvan, until I ceased to exist, and this truth was comforting in its simplicity and its certainty. The knowledge that I had a place and a function and a purpose within the infinite complexity of Imperial systems, that my life meant something even if that meaning was nothing more than... I processed requisition forms and inventory reports with mechanical precision, monitoring shipping schedules and resource allocation patterns, noting anomalies and flagging discrepancies according to standard procedures, and sometimes I noticed patterns in the data that seemed significant, build-ups in specific sectors or unusual resource allocations that might indicate major operations being planned, and I document these patterns in my reports as diligence and attention to detail, and the patterns flow upward through the hierarchy, where they are analyzed and incorporated into strategic planning. And I take satisfaction in knowing that my work contributes to Imperial efficiency and effectiveness, that I am part of something larger than myself, something vast and powerful and eternal, that will bring order to the galaxy regardless of whatever small rebellions or acts of terrorism might temporarily disrupt its perfect function. The shipping manifests pass across my terminal in an endless stream, requisitions for weapons and equipment and supplies that will support operations I will never see, and I process them with the same careful attention I apply to everything, noting delivery schedules and transport routes and inventory quantities. And occasionally I experience a strange sensation looking at these manifests, a feeling that might be recognition, or a sensation, but the sensation passes random. The smell of Coruscant filters through the ventilation systems of the complex, that layered combination of ozone and exhaust and recycled atmosphere, and sometimes when I breathe it in, I feel something that might be sadness or loss, or just physical discomfort from air quality variations. But I cannot identify the source of this feeling or understand what it might mean beyond simple physiological response to environmental conditions, and the feeling fades and I continue working, processing the next manifest and the next report and the next requisition, an endless sequence of tasks that structures my existence and gives meaning to the hours and days and years that accumulate without distinction or significance beyond the contribution they represent to Imperial operation. Cell invites me occasionally to the social gatherings in the commissary, and I attend because it is expected, and because the interaction with colleagues serves important social functions within the department, and we discuss filing systems and requisition approval delays, and the quality of commissary food, and I contribute appropriate observations and responses, and these gatherings are pleasant in their predictability and comfortable in their conformity, everyone wearing identical uniforms and speaking in identical vocabulary, and carefully avoiding any topic that might be considered politically sensitive. And this is how life should be, ordered and structured and safe, free from the chaos and violence and uncertainty exists outside Imperial control. But in the deep hours of the night cycle, when the complex is quiet, and most functionaries are in their residential units, sleeping or engaging in approved recreational activities, when I lie in my sleep pod staring at the ceiling, that the seal something that the reconditioning has not completely erased, a weight or pressure or absence that suggests there should be something more. Neat endless processing of manifests, a weight on the careful We're building towards something rather than just accumulating in meaningless repetition. but I cannot identify what this missing element might be, or why I experience its absence as a kind of ache that has no physical location. And eventually sleep comes, or the scheduled wake cycle begins, and I return to my workstation and resume processing requisition forms, and the feeling fades into background noise that I learn to ignore the same way I ignore the hum of the Zen. I am Kes Darvin, Assistant Logistics Coordinator in the Imperial Navy's Supply and Procurement Division, and I process shipping manifests with efficiency and reliability, and I attend required briefings and propaganda screenings with appropriate attention and loyalty, and I maintain acceptable social relationships with colleagues in my department, and I follow all protocols and requiring nothing. And a desperate yearning for meaning that transcends mere survival. I dismiss these experiences as neural artifacts, glitches in psychological architecture that have no basis in reality, because I am Kes Darvin, and I have always been Kes Darvin, and there has never been anything else, no other identity or purpose or self, just this role and this function and this endless sequence of days processing information about Imperial operations in service to an empire. And if somewhere deep in neural pathways that the reconditioning could not completely overwrite, there remains a fragment of consciousness that remembers volunteering for an assignment that would require the dissolution of self, that remembers years of fear and performance and identity bleed, that remembers an interrogation cell and a broken promise and a betrayal that cascaded through networks of people whose names I can no longer recall, that remembers me offered extraction and choosing to stay because leaving would have meant confronting the void where a person should have been but wasn't anymore. If that fragment still exists and still processes experience and still carries the weight of what was done and what was lost in service to a cause that might have been worthy, or might have been just another system using bodies and minds as expendable resources in pursuit of objectives that individuals could never fully understand. If that fragment remains, it has no voice and no influence and no ability to change anything about this existence, can only observe from some inaccessible distance as Kes Darvin continues processing manifests and attending briefings and maintaining the performance of loyalty that has become indistinguishable from loyalty itself, can only witness the perfect operation of systems over individuals, of roles over identities, of empire over rebellion, of forgetting over remembering, of death that wears the mask of life, and calls it service and expects gratitude for the privilege of continued existence in a galaxy where nothing matters except the endless reproduction of power and control and the careful elimination of any consciousness that might question or resist or imagine that things could be different. I process the next shipping manifest, noting delivery schedules for military equipment being sent to occupation forces in the Outer Rim, and I flag an inconsistency in the inventory quantities, and I submit a report requesting clarification, and my supervisor acknowledges the report and commends my attention to detail, and I return to processing the next report and the next requisition, and the pass and the shift ends and the return to maternity. Regulations specify, and tomorrow I will wake and return to my workstation and process more manifests, and this pattern will continue indefinitely until age or illness or some other factor terminates my usefulness to the Empire, at which point I will be efficiently disposed of and replaced by another functionary who will occupy this workstation and process these same manifests and maintain these same protocols, because individuals are irrelevant and replaceable. Matters beyond its immediate functional contribution, but there is no burden of larger meaning or significance to carry, just the simple reliable repetition of assigned tasks. And this is enough. This has to be enough, because there is nothing else. There has never been anything else, and I am Kes Darvin, and Kes Darvin is content, and contentment is all that anyone can reasonably expect from existence under the perfect order of Imperial control, and just some that is in operational extinction of difference anymore between who I am and who I pretend to be, and that erasure of difference is the Empire's greatest achievement, the transformation of consciousness itself into an instrument of control, and I am grateful to serve, grateful to exist, grateful to exist, grateful to exist, they constitute my life, my purpose, my entire universe, this small illuminated space in the vast darkness where I perform my and even the memory of having existed dissolves into the same void that consumed every authentic thought or feeling, or self I might have possessed before I became what I am now, before I became nothing dressed in purpose, before I became the ghost of someone who thought they could fight an empire, and discovered instead that empires don't fight individuals, they absorb them, they erase them so completely that even the ghost doesn't remember, or it's haunting all. An infinite chorus singing the same note eternally, and the note is my name, and my name is my function, and my function is my existence, and somewhere in the deep structures of this building on this planet at the center of this empire, a terminal glows with its blue-white light. And I sit before it, and I process manifests, and I will always be processing manifests, and there is nothing else, there has never been anything else. There will never be anything else. Tell the difference anymore, and it doesn't matter, because Kestarvan doesn't question, and doesn't wonder, and doesn't remember anything except procedures and protocols, and the endless work that gives shape to days that would otherwise be indistinguishable from each other, each one the same, each one empty, each one exactly what I deserve for having made whatever choice or choices led me to this terminal in this building on this that will mentally cease. Processing in identity that contains nothing except its performance of itself, hollow and perfect and eternal. And if that's death dressed as life, then death is where I live now. Death is what